We are here in New York City and we are filming for the Hamilton College Jazz Archives. We have with us today one of our country's finest jazz historian, Ira Gitler. All right, pleased to have you. Yeah. I want to open with a question and ask you, why is jazz history important?
Well, it's important because the music is important. So we should keep track of what happened and what the lives of the musicians and the breadth of the music over the years, but also because of the way it ties in with our culture. It's so part of our culture, and it's been such a great, not just an entertainment and an artistic enjoyment, but it's been a way of bringing people together and enlightening people about people. Because, let's face it, jazz began as an Afro-American expression, and because of what the great musicians of that tradition put down in the 20s and the 30s and even before, it opened the eyes and minds as well as the ears to people of other persuasions. And it showed something of the humanity and the intellect of these people, where ordinarily some other people might not have made this connection.
One of the early figures that began to get people's attention that this was more than entertainment and there was some incredible craft involved was Louis Armstrong.
Absolutely.
Tell us what he did for the trumpet and what he did for jazz.
Well, I mean, there had been soloists before, and powerful soloists, and of course we've all heard about Buddy Bolden and the cylinder that has never been, the Edison cylinder has never been found. But the people who played with him survived to talk about him and how powerful he was and great in his own way. But in listening to the records of the people who came up with him and started to record, and then you hear Louis Armstrong. He was really the first great soloist in the music, using an incredible technique and power to bring forth the product of a mind that thought not only very musically but very humanly, because I think he embodied all the feelings that people have. He stirred those feelings up with just a phrase or a note or his rhythm. He did it all, and he really freed up, I think, the other musicians to think in a broader way, and that they could do more. Not necessarily just a bravura thing, which he had, but that he was also, telling a story, playing melodies that were just delightful. You didn't have to ask why you were smiling or feeling good, And I think he did all these things. He was literally a giant and genius. We all toss that around a little too much, but he was.
This is something I want you to also comment on. At the time that Louis was in his heyday, one of the things that many students go into music schools now don't realize, there were no method books.
Well, there was the Arbin book, I guess. I don't know when that came in.
Well, that didn't. There was
they didn't have any
jazz
like
harmonies,
that.
though.
No, it just was for technique, and no, I think he listened and he heard, and most of the great musicians, no matter how much training they have, and put that in their service, it's the intuitive and what they soak up and play back at you. Charlie Parker was amazing the way he would hear fragments of songs or whole songs and incorporate them. He just was omnivorous in his listening. You could see, and an incredible retentive memory, as we know from the way he would change his solos from take to take on a particular number. But I don't know if I talked about this when I was up to your class, but it was something I discovered a couple of years ago, that his steeplechase, the theme of his song Steeplechase, was taken from a riff that was used behind Trummy Young's vocal of Margie with Jimmy Lunsford. Oh. And it was record that sold a lot of copies and it had a lot of exposure, and everyone who came up in that period heard it, and obviously Charlie Parker heard it too. And it was just a little phrase that they play when he's taking a breath, and Charlie Parker took that phrase and made a whole tune out of it. That's just one little example. So I think, getting back to Louis Armstrong, I think he heard all the music that was happening around him. Ragtime, the blues, opera, light classical, as they used to call it, the classics. But I think opera was very popular then, and I think a lot of people heard operatic themes. And in fact, I think some of those type of pieces were used as things to warm up on, to practice with. Because there's a record called Laughin' Louie. I don't know if you know that record. It's a novelty, and Louie's having a good time in the studio with everybody, and people are cracking up in between after the vocal. And then he says, here's one of those good old good ones, and no one's been able to ever tell me what it is, and I don't know. But it kind of has that semi-classical, as we used to call it, or light opera or whatever. It's a theme like that, and he plays that and does a lot of miraculous things with it.
I want to ask you a thing about him. They say that when Louis Armstrong took a solo, it seemingly always had this wonderful finished quality. It wasn't as if he rambled or was hunting for notes. It's like when he got to the end, it almost had this feeling of almost inevitable correctness.
Well, I think a lot of the players then, once they got a certain chorus, remember in person, I don't know how long they played, but I think I tend to believe that other than at jam sessions, the live performances were a lot like the recordings, just a couple of choruses. Maybe they stretched a little bit more, but I think once they got a chorus they kind of stayed with that. Now, we have alternate takes of things he's done, and they do vary. But they always have certain elements in them. I guess something he liked, and so he kept it in. And I think he had a great sense of form. But, after his period with the Hot Fives and the Hot Sevens, when he led his own band or fronted Louis Russell's band in the 30s, made a whole gang of records for Decca, which only recently have begun to be recognized as classics. People dismiss them, well, they're commercial, I mean, I don't know what commercial means in that sense, because the tunes may have been pop tunes, but whatever he did with them was transcendent. And you find that he had a formula. The first chorus he would play the straight melody, then he would embellish it in the second, then he would become a little more adventurous in the third chorus, and the fourth chorus maybe he'd reach that climactic thing where he ascended into the stratosphere and just made it a grand finish. So it was always, I think he always had a sense of form.
Tracing the lineage from that trumpet player to another all-time favorite of mine, tell us what you know about Dizzy.
Well, Dizzy, I always say, was one half of my heartbeat, and Charlie Parker was the other, but there are a lot of other people in there too, Lester Young especially, and Coleman Hawkins, people like that, and many, many others. But I discovered Dizzy and Charlie Parker when I was in high school, and I had already been listening to jazz for a long time, but they hit me like a revelation. I became really a fanatic about them. I tried to convert everyone I met. You got to listen to this. And I've told this story a number of times, but the first time I heard Dizzy, and I wasn't aware of him in Cab Calloway's band, although I must have heard him, because my brother, among other records he collected, he loved Lunsford and Goodman and Basie especially, but he also collected Cab Calloway records. So I must have heard Dizzy without knowing it. But the first time I was aware of it was a radio broadcast on a DJ show. There was the 1280 Club in New York on WOV, a guy named Alan Courtney, who played very good music. And one night a week, in the course of his program, he would go to a live wire from some club. And this was a club on 52nd Street. In going back and doing some research, I learned it was the Onyx, and it was Dizzy and Oscar Pettiford, and that what is called the first bebop band to play, as a cohesive unit, you know, with heads that were very typical of the music as it was developing at that time. And I heard this guy playing the trumpet who was announced as Dizzy Gillespie, and I said, God, it sounds like he's playing some wrong notes, you know, but he's interesting. There's something about him that was intriguing. And I didn't hear him again until I heard him on record. And at that time, I think it was Groovin' High with Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. And Bird hit me right away. I mean, I just, you know, said, what is this? You know, it's fantastic. And I got what Dizzy was doing also at the same time. And so, you know, they became like twin idols to me. And when Bird and Dizzy went to California to play at Billy Berg's in December of 1945, I had not yet heard them in person. I wasn't really hanging out on 52nd Street regularly until towards the end of 45, and they had done their famous run at the Three Deuces in May, and then recorded the famous sessions for Guild, Hot House, and Sure Enough, and all that stuff. So I hadn't heard them in person, but I was listening to all their records. And then, of course, the California trip was a disaster. Only the musicians were really picking up on them, and the public was really not ready for them. And Dizzy came back, Bird stayed on in California. And Dizzy opened at the Spotlight Club in 1946, I think it was March, with a small band with Leo Parker on baritone in place of Charlie Parker, no relation. And I went down to hear them, and you know, just knocked me out. And the first piece of writing that I ever did on jazz that was published was in my high school newspaper about Dizzy Gillespie at the Spotlight Club. And you know, the atmosphere on 52nd Street was marvelous, because once you got down there and your face became familiar, you became part of the scenery. It was almost like a stage set. It was 2 blocks between 5th and 7th Avenues, but particularly between 5th and 6th. That was the real concentration. And but even before you were known, the musicians were very open. And I remember Dizzy came by our table, and I said, you know, when are you going to record again? And he said, we recorded today. He had that kind of little sandpapery voice. And it turned out that was the what they called the new 52nd Street jazz album on RCA, February 22nd or something like that. And so he had recorded that day, and we heard him that night. And he was an incredible personality. It was incorporated into his playing, but it was like all one, much like the other giants in the music. But some of them were more sober-sided, you know, not voluble or being able to incorporate the entertainment with the high artistic quality of the music. With Dizzy, you got all of that, like with Louie Armstrong. And he just was electric, you know. The fact that he was doing all these new things, of course, you know, these cascades of notes and the high register work, and then the pretty ballads.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
But he was a personality. He was a zany, you know. he was everything. But as he once said, yeah, you know, they say that I kid around too much and all that. He says, but in the music, I'm serious, you know. And some people failed to get past the other part. They only saw the beret and the goatee and the heavy rimmed glasses and you know, Dizzy, you know. But I thought Teddy Hill said it best. I think his ex-leader, he said he's dizzy like a fox.
Yeah, he was always on top of
so
his craft.
he was one of my heroes.
I want to talk about another aspect here. Is, of course, we're doing our archive here principally based upon the life of Joe Williams and the chronology of the Count Basie band. And I'd like for you to just give us some insights into how the Kansas City scene that spawned some of the great Midwestern Territory bands, and eventually, of course, the great Count Basie band, how that would have been different from what was happening on either coast, and some of its distinctives.
Well, I think it had a lot of the same ingredients that were in the other regional jazzes, if we can say that. But I think their blues were a little different kind of blues, and I think eventually they ended up calling it urban blues as opposed to country blues. But it was the rhythm, the way they smoothed out the rhythm. They got that 4/4 like it was on ball bearings or big rubber tires or something, but it flowed in a way that no other jazz flowed, and I think it had an infectious feeling to it. And all those bands out there had that thing, and I think it was just like in many other situations where jazz flourished and grew, there were a lot of venues for musicians to play, and it was like a happening scene. And the jam sessions went on. Sometimes the performances were like jam sessions. They just went on all night. And so I think when the Basie band started, it came out of other bands, as we know, Walter Page's Blue Devils and Benny Moten's band. And it was formed by musicians who had played with one another, who were comfortable with one another, who thought alike. And it's very unpretentious and very spontaneous. You know, the original Basie band was made up mostly of head arrangements. They didn't have anything written down, and it just developed that way. And fortunately, they had some incredible soloists, each one with a distinctive voice, sometimes two on the same instrument who were opposites and yet compatible, like Herschel Evans and Lester Young on tenors, and Buck Clayton and Harry Sweets Edison on trumpets, and a lot of other play. You know, Hot Lips Page was in at the beginning before they came to New York. But that band just had a special cachet, and I have to speak personally about it because when I started listening to jazz, I was, you know, what, 6, 7, 8 years old, because it was the music you heard on the radio, and when you went to a stage show, you saw a swing band, and it was the swing era. And my brother was a great fan of this music, and probably his favorite band was the Basie band. So that was what I cut my teeth on, among other bands. And I remember him telling me, listen to the way Lester Young starts the band off on every tub, you know, because he had the first lick before the band even came in. And my brother was 12 years older than I was, and, you know, he was like a second father in a way. He used to take me out with his friends, and, you know, I looked up to him, and I found that this interest he had, you know, touched me. I didn't have to think twice about it. So it got me in my soul. And he belonged to a young folks league which did charity raising for an orphanage. And every Sunday afternoon they'd have a dance over at the orphanage, and they'd play all these records and dance to them. Well, Christmas 1938, they hired the Basie band to play at the Manhattan Center in New York as their big fundraiser. And I remember waiting for him to get up that next morning so he could tell me about actually seeing all these people that I'd been listening to on record. So the Basie band is very special to me, and I cherish those early records. And you know, they always say that's the Old Testament band, and then the band that he formed after he had the sextet for a brief time in 1950, when he started up the band again in '51. That's called the New Testament band, and they have in common, you know, the incredible swing, and Freddie Green.
Yeah.
Made the transition.
Yeah,
They tell the story that when Basie formed the sextet, he was opening at the Capitol Lounge, I think, in Chicago, and he hadn't notified Freddie Green. He hadn't hired him, and Freddie Green just came there, plugged in his amplifier into his amplifier, and he was there. So naturally, Basie had to hire him.
What are you gonna do? Tell him to go home?
No way. And he was like, you know, the core of that rhythm section, which they call the All-American Rhythm Section, and it was. So he was the constant. He went from the original band to the sextet, octet, whatever it happened to be at the time, and then the new band, which of course is where Joe Williams comes in.
Yeah. That's where I was going. That's where I was going next. Talk to us about Joe as a singer, as a cultural icon as well.
Well, it's interesting, but I was shuffling through some LPs the other night because my wife had to clean out a certain section, you know, we got to clean that apart. There's too much dust over there. Get these LPs out. It happened to be the end of V through Z. And so I was looking through them naturally after we got them out. And here was Joe Williams. It's a Savoy LP. I don't know if it's been reissued on CD. And it has some of his early work, pre-Basie. And there's a version of Every Day on there. And it points out that he did this, and the thing did nothing. So, you know, everything has its time and its presentation, and everything came together when he made that recording with Basie. Of course, I think it was Ernie Wilkins' arrangement, if I'm not mistaken. Frank Foster plays behind him, like, you know, beautiful obligati. And the band is kicking, and the thing took off, and that really helped establish that band, because the R&B shows, the DJs, were playing Basie, and the young kids started to listen to this band. It wasn't played just on jazz shows, because some of the things they did. And I remember, because I was working for Prestige Records at the time, and we had to monitor Tommy Dr. Jive Smalls. He was the DJ on WWRL out in Long Island, and they were slipping him $5 or $10 to play some of the Prestige numbers, right? So we had to, while we were packing boxes and stuff, we had to listen to see if he was playing it. Well, naturally, you heard everything else. B.B. King doing the 3 o'clock blues, and Count Basie doing, with Joe Williams doing Every Day. And so that really helped put that band over. He was a very important part of that band. And of course, continuing on with a number of things he did that were all big, the comeback and you know, a lot of different things. And then, of course, he branched out, and I started to see him in another light, his ability as an actor. And of course, that helps him to this day to present his songs, because he really puts a lot of other ingredients into it than just singing. You know, he's definitely an actor. And when I saw him on stage at the Newport Jazz Festival in New York, I guess this was the early 70s, when it came from Newport and settled in New York for Cannonball Adderley and Joe combined on a thing that was like The Legend of John Henry. I think it was called Big Man, if I'm not mistaken. And Joe's ability as an actor that I had always seen really came to the fore. And I'm surprised that nobody ever took advantage of putting him in a musical, you know, because he could have carried this off grandly, both as an actor and as a singer. You know, I used to think this about Sarah Vaughan. I don't know if she could have handled the acting, but I would have loved to have heard her in a Broadway musical, just to hear her singing on stage in a certain setting. But he definitely could have done it. And of course, later he shows up on the Cosby Show as the grandfather, and you know, he's marvelous. He's got humor, he's got pathos, he's got all the attributes that an actor has to have. And whenever you see him in performance, these things come out, and he puts those songs over. He gets to the audience, you know, just in an ungimmicked way, you know, because it's all, again, getting back to Dizzy and Louie, it's all part of the persona. It's all one thing. It's not just this is sticking out and saying, oh boy, he's doing this to. You know.
It's not contrived.
No.
Now, I wanted to ask you something about that. We talk about stage presence. Can stage presence be taught, or is it something you have to absorb from culture?
I think it depends on the individual. You know, everybody learns it in one way or another. So I think if the subject is receptive, and it can be taught to him or to her. But a lot of people just pick it up by what they have lived, you know.
What can young singers today learn from the example of a Joe Williams?
Well, they can't learn to have some innate musicality, which I think he had. because one of my bête noirs is all these singers, and it happens to be more on the female side just because they're more female singers, but they all think they can scat. And, you know, there's some sad scatting, because they think all you have to do is do some rhythmic phrases and you're scatting. No, you have to sing some melodies as if you were playing a horn. You have to improvise. And, you know, Joe Williams, quiet as it's kept, can scat. You know, he doesn't do it that often, but, you know, his musicality comes out in another way there. And I think maybe they can learn that from him. They certainly have to learn that just going ooby-dooby-doo does not get it.
You know, I've been in some scenarios in which they try to teach jazz vocals, and they take, they just have all these almost contrived syllables, and it just doesn't take on any authenticity.
Well, everybody has their own syllables. Some people favor the S, you know, sibilants, and other people, like Dave Lambert used to sing with V's. Vo-vio, vio, vio, vio. You know, and other people go use B's and whatever works. But you know, you have to be telling a story just as you would on an instrument, because it is your instrument. But I think you can teach jazz up to a point. Well, you know, you teach it, but you can only lead them so far, and then something else has to take over.
They say you can lead a sax man to water, but you can't make him gig.
And what did Charlie Parker say? Learn everything you can possibly learn, you know, and then forget about it and play. Yeah, well, because hopefully you've gotten it to a place where you don't have to think about it because you know it, and then you let your instincts take over.
I want to ask you about another major figure that I don't think we've really talked about in depth in any of our interviews so far. And I want to talk about it culturally and spiritually because he had those aspects to his character. Tell us about Coltrane.
Well, Coltrane was a serious man. I don't say he didn't laugh and didn't have his own sense of humor. I really didn't see it personally, although I spent some time with him. In fact, I heard him a lot, but he wasn't a great conversationalist. Probably if I'd gotten to know him a little better. But I did interview him for a Downbeat article. I wrote the first article about him in a major publication, or in any publication, I think, of any length. And at that time, he was between apartments, and he was staying at the Park Central Hotel, which later became the Park Sheraton, and I think it's the Park Central again. I can't keep up with it, like WHN and WMGM in New York. And so I went up to his room, and you know, it was a time when I was working with Prestige as a writer. I wasn't there every day anymore, but I had been there in the period when he was when he came with Miles, and then became a recording leader in his own right there. And you know, we hung out and talked, and he was very warm and very serious, and you know, I think a man at that time very aware that some people were misinterpreting him. He had been called an angry young tenor or something in Downbeat, and he said, "I'm only angry at myself when I don't make what I'm trying to do." You know, but he was a very spiritual person. There's no doubt about that. You got that from him, and he battled a lot of demons, you know, and came through it. But it took its toll. And I think about Train, you know, I think a lot of people talk about his great spirituality in his later work, you know, when he really became very pointed towards the spiritual. But he always had it, you know, even when he wasn't playing a Love Supreme or post that. I think in everything he played, when he played a ballad, it was a very spiritual feeling.
It was still there in the sound.
Yeah, and he had a distinct sound, there's no doubt about that, and that's something every musician strives for, is to get that recognizable, that individual sound, and he had it, and of course then everybody keeps coming behind him, figuring, boy, this sounds good, I'm going to play like that, which is what always happens. And some did it and brought something of themselves to it, and others didn't.
Some people say it's not wise to look for a man's predecessor amongst his imitators.
Well, you know, sometimes he influenced people who already had established styles too.
Uh-huh.
He was such a powerful force, and it wasn't just the people who came up behind him. It was some of the people that were already there, and then they had to come to maybe a rapprochement between what they had been before they heard him and what he gave them, and then they kind of sorted it out and maybe went back to being themselves and retaining something of him.
I have a couple more questions I want to ask you. We talk about culture, and you early on talked about African American culture and how that it gave something to jazz.
Yeah.
Okay, where is it now, and can it revitalize itself? I say this in lieu of the march, the Million Man March, because that to me represented something perhaps maybe trying to come back together. Will that surface in music in some way, in jazz?
Well, I think it has surfaced in jazz because I've written about this also, and I don't know, no one has really picked up on it. I thought that the continuity of jazz in the black community was kind of co-opted by radio and television. I don't say that rhythm and blues wasn't great. I used to enjoy it very much, and other forms of black music, of course, gospel. If you're not moved by that, I think you're ready for the grave. There's all forms, but there's certain commercialized musics coming from all areas in American life, where everything becomes more of a manufactured quality, and because it is the thing that's making money, that's what's played on the radio. And I called it kind of a cultural genocide when jazz was just wiped off the radio. And I used to go into black communities when I was in college and in my post-college years and connect with people because we all had the same records, and I was, listening. We were listening to the music together and all that. And then I found more and more that the young black people coming up didn't know anything about jazz because they didn't hear it anymore. And the advent of Wynton Marsalis has brought, as you know, a raft of great young black musicians. They weren't coming to the music. Not only was the black community not listening to it, but as a result, we weren't getting any young black musicians that were really playing it. And since Wynton came up, he didn't do it alone, but he is a great part responsible for it. When he came, he and his brother Branford came with Art Blakey, and people heard them, and young musicians or young black people who maybe hadn't even thought about taking up instruments were inspired because they saw someone who was a contemporary playing this music and looking sharp, and and so from that time on, the 80s through the 90s, look at all the great young talents that we have. And I know the argument has been made, they're just doing that same old thing, they're doing that old music, yeah, but they've gotten back to some of the truths of this music, the traditions of this music, and I'm a great believer in tradition. And maybe they're playing the music of Louis Armstrong and Jelly Roll Morton and Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and John Coltrane and Mingus and whatever, and the whole history of the music. And I think that's important, and I think that's where we have a new beginning. There, I feel, was a mini renaissance, and I think we'll take it from there. And they're not just imitating. They're learning, and they're putting their own spin on it because there are other things in the air than what were in the air when those musics were made. So it's got to be a little different. And you know, I'm the boring old college professor that has his certain pet stories, and this one is the one I use. I say it's like a plant. If you cut it back, it's the same plant, but it might grow with a different configuration. And I think this is what's happened when you go back to those the roots of this music and with all the giants. So you're really, in essence, you're cutting it back, and then it's going to grow again in a new way. And who knows what it's going to lead to this time, because it kind of almost got lost. It never got completely lost because there were people playing it and people listening to it. In fact, the old records were always selling. You know, every generation they reissue the, just for an example, the Miles Davis Quintet on Prestige, and every new generation buys these now in CD. Before they bought the LP reissue, you know, the twofer or whatever it was. You know, it's a new configuration. And so the music is constantly fresh to a new generation because they didn't hear it before. And where they're going to take it, we don't know, but that's the interesting part.
And this is kind of a follow-up, can jazz, you know, for instance, we talk about the big band period, and we say how two great things, people were dancing and people were listening on the radio. Can jazz ever become America's popular music again?
Looking at it right now, I don't think so, but who knows? You know, that was a particular time. If you're talking about big bands, you know, economically it's not feasible. In fact, if you have a sextet and you want to book it, you're probably better off cutting it back to a quintet. You might have a better chance, right? And, you know, big bands exist now in little places once a week, or some bands have existed getting bookings, you know, going to Europe and Japan and all that, but the big band is not a viable thing. But once ballrooms ceased and the theater stage shows and hotel rooms where bands played, you know, the venues dried up. And if you're a club owner, you put a big band in and you have a bigger nut to cover. I heard the Jimmy Heath big band recently, which is not together all the time by any means, and they played over at Iridium, one of the New York's newer clubs. It's only been a couple of years. And I'm sure that everybody was making scale. They weren't making a lot of money, but it took a lot of courage to put a big band in there for a week, and people dug it, and I think they're going to go back in. There's nothing quite like a big band in full roar, and you know, you can't duplicate that. So, but I don't think it's going to come back in the same way. There's no reason why people can't dance to smaller combos, and you know, we used to have that. People danced, and the people that didn't want to dance got up around the bandstand and listened. And even at jam sessions, which I used to go to a lot in the 40s, they had chairs set up in the back. These were organized jam sessions. Sunday afternoon gig, that was the typical traditional time for that, Sunday afternoon, late afternoon into early evening. And they'd set up chairs towards the back of the ballroom and leave space in the front for people to dance. So it was just the opposite of when you went to hear a big band and people danced in the back and people crowded up around the bandstand to listen. They prefigured this, you know.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you perhaps maybe just one last question here, and that is, you know, students, hopefully the students even at our college and perhaps even other colleges will see these tapes. Tell us a few things that students should know about jazz other than just the names and dates and
Well, the names and dates are things that you latch on to once you get interested in a particular band or a particular musician, and so you want to know when this happened, how it happened, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the thing to do is keep your ears open and listen as much as you can. And the more you listen, the more knowledgeable you become, and the more sophisticated in your listening, and you're able to make judgments and comparisons, and also to understand your taste, because everyone's taste is different, and but you kind of begin to see what you like more, and one recording may lead you to another, and then it's like I had a friend who liked jazz, but he wasn't avidly as into it as myself, and he took Slam Stewart. He loved Slam Stewart, singing and bowing the bass at the same time. Everybody kind of, you know, could get with that. And because he liked Slam, and I played the record of Groovin' High, which I spoke of before, for him, and Slam plays on that. So he bought that because of Slam, and then he said to me, wow, Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. So Slam Stewart really opened that other thing up for him. And, you know, just keep your ears open and listen. And as we used to say, reading movie criticism when we were teenagers, after you get to know your critics, same thing in jazz, you know what to expect from them, and you know when and who will say something that you can rely on, but you have to use your own ears, basically. Just use that as a guide. You know, you have to listen for yourself. The more you listen, the more you know, and the more you'll enjoy it.
Two things, real fast, real fast.
Yeah.
You're doing some work, being asked to provide information for scripts for a documentary, is that right? On Lewis and on Hamp?
No, I did that years ago.
Okay, tell us how that was for, you know, providing the facts, helping to provide the facts for a documentary like that.
Well, I just did my research, you know, starting with my own experience, my own knowledge of it up to that point, and then you just delve in and read as much as you can, and if you're able to talk to some of the musicians who were there, I think that's very important. We have some great sources of information and expertise, people that were actually there and did it, who are still alive. Milt Hinton and Doc Cheatham and people like this, who can tell us things that you know, we don't know firsthand. Just as I can tell things firsthand because I was there at a certain time in the history of the music. And so whenever you can avail yourselves of the actual musicians, I think it's very important to do that.
Well, thank you so much. And we're going to kind of wrap up here, and thank you for coming and sharing some very precious insights about some of our major icons in this idiom. And we hope that this, not only this taping of this particular session, but the information that you're telling finds its way into the hearts of students who are interested in this art form.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.